Borodar, good morning and welcome to the second webinar in our series, Ways Forward, Evidence and Insights for the Next Welsh Government. My name is Dan Bristow and I'm the Director of the Wales Centre for Public Policy. The WCPP is an independent evidence centre based at Cardiff University, and we work to bridge the gap between research and decision-making by making rigorous evidence and expertise accessible, relevant and actionable for decision makers across Wales. And for this webinar series, we're glad to be partnering with the IWA. The IWA is an independent think tank, charity and membership organisation. They produce agenda-setting research and policy on Wales's economy and democracy, and they provide platforms for informed debate, including through their events and in-house current affairs magazine called The Welsh Agenda. Before we get going in earnest, I've got a few housekeeping notices. First off, as you'll have noticed, this is a webinar on Zoom, so participants are muted by the host. There's going to be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and we're using the Q&A function. If you have a look at the bottom of your screen or the Zoom window, you should be able to see a button, a Q&A button there. And I'll just emphasize this because from a logistical perspective, it makes a huge difference if you use that rather than the chat function. But we do encourage you to use the chat function to introduce yourselves and to engage with what you're listening to and with each other. I'd ask you to remember that all chat and questions are recorded, and we'll be sharing a recording of today's event via both the IWA and WCPP websites and YouTube channels. Okay, so housekeeping done. What's the purpose of this webinar series? Well, what we wanted to do was look at some of the challenges that await the next Welsh Government and to bring together evidence and expert insight to stimulate conversations about the key questions and some of the potential ways forward. This second webinar is focused on how the Welsh Government can best prevent and reduce child poverty and support families experiencing financial hardship. For the last 2 decades, around 30% of children have been growing up in poverty in Wales. Whilst the recent UK government decision to abolish the 2-child limit on benefits is likely to reduce child poverty by around 3 or 4 percentage points, huge numbers of families across Wales will continue to struggle to make ends meet. The next Welsh Government will face the challenge of unacceptably high levels of child poverty, with all that this implies for the well-being of current and future generations. To explore this topic, we've invited our speakers to respond to one or more of 3 questions. Firstly, what do we know about the scale and nature of child poverty in Wales today, and how is this likely to evolve over the coming Senedd term? Secondly, what can an incoming Welsh Government do to reduce the scale and depth of child poverty? And finally, how can we strengthen local and community inclusion and support for families in poverty? I'm now going to invite each of our contributors to speak for a few minutes before opening up for questions. First up is Mike Brewer. Mike is the Deputy Chief Exec and Chief Economist at the Resolution Foundation. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much. I think there are going to be some slides. I'll just wait for that to catch up. So I work for the Resolution Foundation, a think tank based in London, which strives to increase the living standards of families on low to middle incomes across the UK. And one of the things we have done is think about how living standards might change over the next 5 years and what that means for poverty in the UK and in Wales. So let me start with, go on to the next slide. This, of course, is thinking about poverty in a very much about family income. So the usual definition, below 60% of median income. So it's definitely thinking about child poverty just as about family income. And there are obviously limitations to that, which obviously, and some of our speakers will take a broader perspective. But let's start here. So the chart shows the rates of child poverty in the UK and in Wales and our projections of what will happen over the next 5 years. And these projections are using the same sort of projections about the whole economy that are used by the UK Treasury and the Office of Budget Responsibility when they are forecasting the economy over the next few years. So let's just start with a trend. We see the trend in child poverty since the early 2020s has been upwards. We are projecting a significant fall in child poverty, as Dan said, in April 26, when the two-child limit is abolished and when the standard allowance of universal credit gets a chunky 6% rise. And then we're projecting not much change over the rest of the UK Parliament or throughout the next Senate term. That's partly because there are will be some additional small real terms rise in universal credit. That helps. On the other hand, there are things like the local housing allowance and benefit cap, which are frozen in nominal terms, and that doesn't help. More broadly, what we think is going on for the rest of the 2020s is that the economy actually just isn't really doing very much. And so median income and therefore the poverty line are also not really changing in real terms. So it's a period where there's just not much growth anywhere in the income distribution in incomes. Okay, that's the trend. And then what about the levels? Well, we think the rate of child poverty in Wales is slightly above the rest of the UK. Part of this is driven by Scotland and Northern Ireland having rates that are quite a lot lower than the rest of the UK. I haven't shown those, but they would be considerably down towards the bottom of that chart. But the rate in Wales is also a little bit higher than in England. Now, we haven't done a detailed decomposition, but the primary drivers of this measure of child poverty, and particularly the differences between England and Wales, will be differences in paid work and wages among parents, and differences in housing tenure and costs. Now, the lower rate in Scotland is primarily driven by their Scottish child payment, so they've got the ability to go beyond the UK government in their social security system, and that is making a big difference to child poverty. But that's not the case in Wales at the moment. Okay, so what might anyone do to try and solve this, and particularly the Senate? If we go on to the next chart, I'm going to focus mostly on parental work, and because many people say that one thing we need to do is to get more parents working more. But of course, one of the major social changes over the last 30 years has been that parents are indeed working more and more. Now, this chart has a UK perspective, but it's showing the work status of parents who are in poverty. Now, the colours are deliberate, so the two red sort of areas at the bottom show families where nobody is in paid work. The green families towards the top show the families where every adult is working full time, and the blue families, everybody else. And this shows what I think is a very well-known trend, that working poverty is up. So that decline of the red bars, there are fewer and fewer families in poverty are workless, more and more families in poverty have at least one working parent. Can we get more parents working more? Well, if we go on to the next chart, of course, the issue is as we push up the parental employment rate, those who are left not working are increasingly likely to have barriers to work. So if we look at the left-hand bit of that chart, here we are looking at the parents who are in poverty and are not working, and just asking what fraction of them have one of four, what you might think of being barriers to work. So half of non-working parents in poverty have a child under 5. Nearly half of non-working parents in poverty report a long-standing illness or disability, with just under a third being in a large family and just over a quarter having a disabled child. And then you can see that sort of the incidence of these barriers to work is unsurprisingly much higher among the non-working parents in poverty on the left than it is among the working parents in poverty. That's on the right-hand side. But the point here is that as the parental employment rate rises, as it has done over the last few years, those who are left behind are going to require even more support or help to get into work. We also hear policymakers talk about progression, and I definitely went to quite a few roundtables as part of the UK government's child poverty strategy over the last 12 months, where ministers there were interested in labour market progression. And on the next slide, I wanted to share a few thoughts from qualitative research that either we've done or other people have done that really reminds us that for working parents around in poverty or just by poverty, this idea of progression can seem miles away from their lived experience. So 3 themes I would draw out of a series of qualitative research projects. I mean, one thing you can hear is that parents in poverty are in survival mode. Living in poverty has exhausted their financial resources and their psychological resources. And if you just mention the idea they might get a better job or seek a pay rise, they just just can't comprehend this concept. They're just struggling to get by, whether that's financially or psychologically. A second constraint, again, you hear this really often, is that for working parents, it that you're trying to fit in your work alongside the constraints of your partner's working schedule, your children's school, maybe you've got a preschool child as well, and the commuting options and the childcare options. And what we can find when you talk to working parents is they've got something that works really well for them, and they are very, very, very loath to disrupt that, to just change that, to disturb that. So that makes parents cautious about taking on a new job. And that's particularly the case for jobs without set hours of work, which you might be increasingly likely to find towards the bottom end of the labour market. So people just don't want to change because it's too risky. And then sometimes you hear parents talk about the financial disincentives or the fact that there's not really gain to progressing in the labour market. So yes, you might get some more money from a promotion or from increased hours, but that might not be worth the payoff, either because you might lose some universal credit, or you might get a promotion which gives you only sort of a pound or two an hour more, but gives you a lot more stress and responsibility and perhaps a reduction in flexibility. So they just don't think it's worth it. So I'm not saying that progression is impossible, but I'm saying that when you talk to parents, you can find a variety of responses that can remind you that progression is not the panacea that it might be to improving parents' position in the labour market. Um, if we go on to the next slide, that also means that if a strategy for labour market progression, and this will be my last slide, whether that's local authorities thinking about this or the Welsh Government or the UK government, it really is important to think that your strategy has to be all encompassing. You'll need action on multiple fronts. Which means also that no single one of these is going to be the magic lever you pull to unleash progression in the labour market amongst parents. So yes, of course, childcare is an important constraint for working families, working parents. A great deal, rather more has been done for preschool children than for school-age children, and rather more is done for working parents at the moment compared to parents who are in education and training. Although actually Wales does a better job there than the rest of the UK. Transport is hugely important when you talk to families in poverty. So improving public transport options so that families have a greater choice of jobs, it can be a way to unlock progression. We think the UK government's strategy on employment rights may help. So getting rid of exploitative zero hours contracts, things which can give workers more confidence that the next job they move to will be one they have some control over and they have more leverage. Again, might make progression a less risky prospect. And of course, we need to think about the skills agenda so that parents have more opportunities to move to different jobs. So I think I'll leave it there. I focus my talk on what we think might happen to child poverty in Wales over the next few years and what's the scope for employment and work to do something about that.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to move us straight on to our next contributor. Helen Barnard is the Director of Policy Research and Impact at Trussell. Over to you, Helen.
Hi, thanks, Dan. Lovely to see everyone. So in Wales, as across the rest of the UK, we've seen this incredibly worrying rise in the numbers of people facing severe hardship in recent years. So more and more people who are facing hunger because they simply can't afford the essentials that we all need. And what we're seeing is this deepening hardship is particularly concentrated among families with children. So last year, we published a report into hunger in Wales. We found about a quarter of families with children in Wales were facing hunger. That's 3 times as high as the rate for families without children. We've obviously, as Trussell, we're seeing this on the ground in the increased need for emergency food, the pressure that food banks have been under. So last year, food banks in the Trussell community in Wales provided 172,000 emergency food parcels. Now that's an increase of 93% compared to a decade ago. In the last 5 years alone, that provision has risen by 26%. So it's really steep rises that we've seen. And the majority of the support that food banks are providing in Wales is needing to be accessed by families with children. Now it's worth saying that people are turning to food banks fundamentally because they do not have the money they need for essentials. So people are between jobs, they have health conditions, they are caring for relatives or children. A growing number are actually in work, but that work is insecure, it doesn't pay enough to live on, it doesn't give you a steady wage. And as Mike was saying, we hear a lot about the lack of affordable housing, transport, childcare, and also problems accessing the support that is out there. So to start turning the tide on this, we need to see changes at a UK level in our social security system and in targeted intervention in Wales across areas like housing, health, childcare, advice. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. But before I do, one of the things that we're also very worried about is that charitable food provision is becoming normalised in communities across Wales. So there's obviously food banks, but there's been a growth in other forms of charitable food provision, whether that's pantries, social supermarkets, food clubs, community fridges, all those things. And what we really see is that both food banks and these other kinds of food support obviously can be a lifeline for people in the moment at the time they desperately need practical support. But none of those forms of support actually provide the solution to the problem that we're seeing. Because we need to follow the evidence and tackle the underlying drivers of hunger and hardship. And that evidence is pretty clear that neither kind of free emergency food or subsidised food are the best sources of crisis support. And quite often, they don't do enough to embed the kind of preventative approaches that will build financial resilience, which is what will turn the tide. So what we'd like to see from the next Welsh Government and from all the parties as we head into election time is, first of all, a really explicit commitment that we are going to end the need for food banks in Wales. That's something we saw in Scotland, and it was a catalyst for driving greater action. So we want to see the Welsh Government do that, and we want to see all the political parties commit to that, so that across the spectrum we have that unified intention. And then we need to see a really practical plan to deliver it over the course of the next Senedd. So that plan needs to include things like, first of all, there is funding that's going to local authorities, to food partnerships, that is explicitly aimed at reducing what is termed food poverty, but it is just poverty. And we need to make sure that that funding is being used to tackle the local drivers of the need for emergency or subsidised food, that we're focusing in on those drivers, not just on that kind of immediate lifeline of food in the moment. The second thing is cash first crisis support is absolutely vital. We really see the impact of this where it works well. We have the discretionary assistance fund in Wales, making sure that that support is adequate for people to cover the essentials. At a minimum, the funding needs to be going up with inflation, and making sure everyone who applies for that fund is offered advice and other practical support to help tackle those drivers that have landed them in the position where they need crisis support. Now, Mike mentioned the impact of the Scottish child payment in Scotland. We've seen that on the ground in food banks as well as in the stats. So I think, as others are advocating for, we're really clear the Welsh Government should be scoping the options to introduce a Welsh child payment, and there should be a clear intent that that is something we want to roll out across Wales. I think some of the other types of support that would help, so increasing access for free school meals. So all families who get universal credit should be getting free school meals, automating that as much as possible, and children who are in households with no recourse to public funds or have an income below universal credit, whether or not they're actually getting that. I think we talked about support, so boosting childcare support and ending, I think, what a lot of people see as the postcode lottery. And then just the last couple of things on housing. There's two key things. We see this so much at food banks, that people who are in temporary accommodation, the quality, the safety of that is not where it should be. So we think there needs to be better guidance, better legislation to make sure if somebody is having to go into temporary accommodation, it needs to be safe, and they need to have access to cooking facilities, to places to store food, laundry, Wi-Fi. It sounds so basic, but we are seeing at food banks a lot of people who are struggling because they don't have those kinds of basic facilities, and that is not right. But we need to reduce the number of people in temporary accommodation. It is not a good position for anybody to be in. And also people who are struggling to afford rents in the private rented sector. And the two obviously are very closely connected, homelessness being driven by people who simply can't afford to keep renting. So we think the next Welsh Government should be setting out a clear plan to increase the number of social homes in Wales. And my last point is about advice services. So we've seen in food banks, when you can get people quick access to really good advice about debt, about benefits, about housing, mental health support, that can be transformative. But I think all of us will be seeing that those services across Wales are really struggling, and are struggling with funding, are struggling with capacity. So we need sustainable increased funding for those advice services, and we need to get them to people in communities so that you don't have to end up at a point you access a food bank before you get debt advice. That is clearly not right. And my very last point, something that I suspect Stefan may also be talking about, making it easier for people to access the support they're entitled to by properly driving through the Welsh Benefits Charter across Wales. So all local authorities are prioritising, simplifying and increasing access to Welsh benefits. You see the impact when that happens, but it's still very patchy. So we need to see a real drive for that. I'll stop there and hand back to Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And I'm going to pass straight on to Stefan. So Stefan Evans is the CEO at the Bevan Foundation.
Yeah, Bore da. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invite to join you this morning. So I can see the slides are firing up on my screen, so that's great. So if you skip on to the next slide. Just in case people aren't familiar with us, the Bevan Foundation is a think tank working to find lasting solutions to poverty and inequality in Wales, and we've done work on a range of the areas that this webinar is covering this morning. If you want to go on to the next slide. Just to say that some of the stuff I'm touching on this morning, we're going to be exploring in a bit more depth. We're going to be publishing a report at an event we're holding at the Urdd in Cardiff on the 17th of March. So there's an opportunity there if people are interested to get involved with that conference. It should be an interesting day, and there'll be a report that comes alongside it. So if you're interested in this morning's discussion, please do check that out. Go on to the next slide. So I thought I'd just give it a little bit of context, I guess, about where are we at with poverty in Wales, and possibly some reflections about why haven't we made more progress. So I think Mike shared the projections going forward. In terms of what's happened in the last 20 years, it's been a period of stagnation. Just over a third, just over 30% of children in Wales live in poverty. That's been pretty stagnant, pretty flat. But that masks a reality that's going on, and that links to what Helen was just talking about in terms of the number of people feeling hardship. What we've seen over that period is the people already living in poverty have become poorer in Wales. So we are now at a point where 47% of those in poverty in Wales live in deep or very deep poverty. And to put that into context, for the median family of 2 adults and 2 children living in poverty in Wales between 1994 and 1997, they needed an extra £3,800 in their pockets to lift them out of poverty. This, and even adjusted for inflation, that now stands at £7,200. So the poorest people in Wales are almost twice as poor as they were going back 20, 30 years. And if you go on to the next slide, that has important kind of implications, I guess, about why not more progress has been made. Some of the key drivers around that deepening poverty have been decisions taken at the UK government level. So things like the 2-child limit, changes to LHA, the lack of sufficiency for the benefit system more broadly, some of the stuff you've already heard from. That provides really important context when we're measuring the success or the lack of success of Welsh Government policy interventions. So if you think that, kind of the policy interventions you need to put an extra £7,200 in a family of 4's pockets are significantly larger than the interventions you would need to put £3,800 in those pockets. So sometimes it might, that context is worth bearing in mind when viewing general success or failure of a given policy intervention. It might not be that policy intervention hasn't worked. You're just measuring the counterfactual, because things would have got even worse for those families had that Welsh Government decision not been taken. So that's important to know, and that limitation of a devolution settlement is a key factor of why less progress has been made. But there are things that could have been done better at a Welsh level as well. So thinking about stuff such as the child poverty strategies, for example, I think there's been the timings around at which points these strategies have been published have not really been conducive, I think, to being effective tools for driving policy change. If we think of the most recent strategy was published in 2024, that was published literally as the cooperation agreement between Labour and Plaid was coming to an end. So all the money had been spent. So what that strategy ends up being is a list of all the fantastic stuff that the government has already announced it's doing, rather than an opportunity to look to the future and to kind of say, and this is what we will be doing going forward. And we've seen that before about some of these strategies being published a year before an election. That is kind of that's not the peak time to be thinking long term and about investing new ideas in. And around targets as well, I think we have been burnt by our experiences around the 2020 ending child poverty target, and there's been an aversion in Wales, I think, to having open conversations about actually the useful role that targets can play in addressing some of these challenges. Another two challenges then I think we've seen is first that some children have been missing from the approach that we've taken. So thinking in particular about some of the data you've already heard, but over half of the children living in poverty in Wales live in a family where the youngest child is age 4 or younger. Yet, in terms of where the policy interventions have been taken by Welsh Government, it's probably the age group where the least action has been taken at all. Most of the action has been taken around school-age children, and particularly primary school. So are we surprised then that there are barriers to work, etc., that are having an impact on those families? So there's been gaps in terms of which children we've been looking at. And I think there's also then a general question about scale. In the report we've got coming up, we've got a table that shows a vast number of small policy projects or interventions that are 1 million here, 1 million there, which in themselves are probably not going to be making really much difference in terms of shifting the dial on child poverty. And there is a question possibly by thinking about how do we better balance putting the right amount of money into a scheme that will make a bigger difference, whilst also being aware that there will be some children who fall between the cracks and you still need something for those children. So if you go on to the next slide. So yeah, in terms of what can the next Welsh Government do, kind of thinking in terms of that. So we think an obvious starting point, kind of linking from what I just said, is there needs to be a strategy for the government term. The election's in May. By Christmas, having a strategy that's saying this is our priority, and that really sends a signal, I think, in terms of when the programme for government is being developed, all of that sort of stuff, that this is a real priority area for us. We are going to be making decisions, therefore, that involve applying extra funding into these schemes that will make a difference, so that timing, so that we've got something for right at the start of the government to give the real best opportunity for delivery is something that's absolutely vital. And I think that's one of the maybe challenges at the moment around, Helen mentioned the Welsh Benefits Charter, is that it could inevitably, as you come towards the election, you lose momentum in terms of implementing stuff because people's eyes inevitably start drifting towards, well, there might be a different government, what might happen. The sooner you can start the process of implementing these actions, the better the chances are of you making good progress and these changes actually being delivered. We do think that there's a scope for targets. We do think there's a role for them. And in particular, we think there's a role to be looking at things around deprivation, etc., where actually the Welsh Government does probably have enough policy levers to be making a real difference in terms of the number of children living in temporary accommodation, living in deprivation, visiting food banks. There are things within its controls there where it could be having kind of much clearer focus in terms of activity by thinking about targets. And the importance as well of linking with other policy areas. Housing is a topic we've heard a bit about already today. So how is your housing strategy linked to your child poverty strategy? These are things that need to be joined up. The focus on building new social housing, that is absolutely vital. Are we building, therefore, the right type of social housing for families? We know that there's a shortage, in particular, of social housing for larger families. Well, are we addressing that through our housing building programme? We then kind of building on what I said, I think there is a case for looking at big impact actions that could be taken. And we did some modelling last spring with Policy and Practice, the report's available on our website, who looked at particular impact of 6 different policy interventions on reducing poverty rates in Wales. And the two that came through as having the greatest impact would be action around a child payment an action around childcare. So I won't dwell too long on child payments. I think Helen and Mike have already covered that, and I think we'd echo what Helen said about looking for ways to getting this delivered. The devolution settlement does have these jagged edges, and obviously it would be cleaner to have the devolution in full so that you can do this as you want. But there is often, if there's a will, there's a way, and there is a conversation possibly to be had around that. On childcare, you know, the provision we currently have in Wales doesn't work on a number of reasons. First, there is no support for anyone between 9 months and two. And secondly, we have got three different childcare programs for when we get to an age where people might be able to have it. And it becomes a nightmare for people to navigate that, to work out what they're entitled to, and actually get into everything that they're entitled to. Moving mothers of younger children into part-time work would have a significant impact in reducing the impact on depth of poverty, and therefore ensuring kind of universal provision to make sure that all children get access to that high quality education as well on a part-time basis, with then a tiered kind of extra support then depending on your income is something that we think a model that should be explored and should be being put in practice by the next government. And that links again then with some of the stuff that Helen touched on already, touched on stuff like the Welsh benefit system. This message that keeps coming over and over again about kind of schemes being disjointed, being separate from each other, making it easier for people to access is absolutely crucial. Finally, then, I think from me for now, even if you kind of had success with some of those big impact areas, where I think if you did invest in those, you would be making a meaningful reduction in child poverty rates in Wales. You will still have children who fall through the cracks, as Mike has said, kind of people who the role of in-work poverty would mean even if you got more children and parents into work, there would still be people in poverty. There'll be people with health conditions who's that not appropriate to. We've heard around NRPF already as well. All of these things would be there. So what we need to think about is how can the Welsh Government make more effective use of its tools to mitigate the various excesses of deep poverty. The discretionary assistance fund is a clear one. It is vital that as we move to the election, that we don't ditch everything that is already being done as well. There's a tendency sometimes to want to come in and do something new. All the evidence that we've got shows that that does make a real difference to people's lives, and therefore it's vital that we keep and improve investment in such a scheme rather than necessarily ditching it and replacing it with something else. And then finally, free school meals is something we've already heard about as well. In 2019, a single mother working 17 hours a week qualified for free school meals for their child in secondary school in Wales. Because we haven't changed the eligibility criteria, that parent now would have to work about 12 hours a week. So no child from the family who would be deemed in work by the Welsh Government's own approach to childcare would now qualify for free school meals. So these kind of increasing the eligibility for that is an obvious thing that could be looked at in our opinion. I hope that I think that covers everything I was going to say. Yes, it does. So diolch yn fawr, and I'll hand back to Dan.
Thanks, Stefan. Lots of ideas already that we've heard, and lots of interesting contributions from the speakers so far. So just to remind you, there's the Q&A function. Start putting your questions in there, and as we get through these contributions, we can start to pick up some of the questions and shape a discussion around them. Next, I wanted to hand over to Karen Beryl. Karen is a co-production and lived experience expert linked to the Poverty Insight Lab. Karen.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you for the invitation to contribute today. I want to begin with something simple. In the UK, child poverty is measured as living below 60% of median income after housing cost. That tells us how many children are below a line, but it does not tell us how it feels to live there. So through the Poverty Truth Commission and the Poverty Insight Lab, we've spent years listening to people navigating poverty, not just as service users, but as parents, carers, workers and neighbours. And what comes through consistently is this. Poverty is not experienced only as a lack of income. It is experienced as a lack of safety. Safety in systems, safety in services, and safety in everyday interactions. In our recent research around poverty stigma in Wales, 1 in 4 people reported experiencing poverty stigma in the last year. And among households earning under £20,000, that rises to 1 in 3. So that tells us something important. Because stigma is not just about attitudes, it operates through systems, spaces, and relationships. People told us about having to repeat their stories again and again to perform need in order to access help, about feeling believed second and checked first, about walking into a food bank feeling exposed as if carrying a banner announcing failure, and about children carrying the shame of free school meals into adulthood. That is not captured in the poverty rate. The calculated model tells us how many, but the human experience tells us at what costs. And when policy is designed only around the calculated model, we risk building systems that chase numbers while missing the relational and psychological realities shaping children's lives. Scale matters, depth matters, and persistence matters. We should absolutely measure how many children are below the poverty line, but we should also be asking how far below, for how long, how volatile is family income, and what administrative burdens are families carrying just to access this support. Because threshold metrics create threshold solutions. They may shift the line, but they do not necessarily build long-term security. So if we're serious about reducing the poverty rate itself and not simply easing pressure, then income has to move. That means looking seriously at upgrading benefits, at direct child payments, at housing costs, and at work incentives that penalise small increases in incomes. These are the kinds of policies that shift the line. They reduce depth, they change the statistics. But our community research shows us something equally important. How support is delivered matters just as much as how much is delivered. So when systems require people to repeatedly prove crisis, it erodes dignity. And when services are fragmented, intimidating, or adversarial, they erode trust. And when trust erodes, uptake falls, stress rises, and the depth of poverty becomes entrenched. So for us working at Swansea Poverty Truth Commission, we were looking at rehumanising systems, not just as a cosmetic change. So what this means is believing people first, reducing repetitive assessments, removing unnecessary security barriers, designing environments that feel welcoming rather than punitive, joining services so there is no wrong door, and bringing lived experience into design and delivery, not as consultation but as shared authority. So it's not about being softer, it's about being more effective, because hostile systems drain energy that could otherwise build families and communities. One of our civic and business commissioners once reflected that poverty does not just drain income, it drains the potential for creativity, innovation, resourcefulness. When people are constantly navigating bureaucracy, they're not building stability. So the question for a new government that I kind of want to bring into this space is not whether child poverty matters, it's this. Are we prepared to redesign the systems that quietly reproduce it? If we continue to measure only thresholds, we will continue to produce threshold level change. If we continue to prioritise administrative control over human dignity, we will continue to erode trust. And if we treat community knowledge as anecdotal rather than structural insight, we will miss the opportunity in front of us. Our community research was quite clear. People do not want to be managed more efficiently. They want to be met with safety, dignity, and stability. So it's not radical, it's foundational. And the choice is whether we are willing to design for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. That's a really powerful call to action. Thank you. I was going to turn to Amanda next. So Amanda is a colleague of mine at the Welsh Centre for Public Policy, where she is the Director of Policy and Practice, focusing on public services, but has also led our work around tackling inequalities. Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks, Dan. Brodar, good morning, everyone. Over the last 12 years at the Welsh Centre for Public Policy, we've been bringing together evidence and expertise to explore what can be done to reduce the scale and depth of child poverty. Next slide, please. And the framework you can see on the slide here shows how we think about and organise the ways in which the Welsh Government and others can consider actions to alleviate poverty. There are evidence reviews available on our website related to interventions and programmes in each of these 4 areas. Research we conducted based on lived experience evidence highlighted the mental health burden of being in poverty, and in particular, the role of stigma in linking poverty and poor mental health, as Karen has already talked about. Poverty stigma is when people are negatively judged, excluded, or treated unfairly because they live on a low income. It can come from other people, public services, and the media, as well as being internalised. Recently, we've been focusing on exploring what can be done through public policy and practice to strengthen local and community inclusion and support to reduce poverty and the stigma associated with it. We found that many of the actions that can be taken to prevent poverty stigma also help to create an enabling environment to help children and families access pathways out of poverty and to take up support to maximise incomes and reduce costs. So how do children experience poverty stigma in Wales? Next slide, please. One indication of this is annual survey data from children in Wales, which consistently shows that the most significant impact of poverty on children in schools is being bullied or looked down on. So as with adults in poverty, children often feel the social and psychological dimensions of poverty most acutely. Next slide, please. Poverty and poverty stigma create barriers to children participating in school life. And as you can see from this Welsh Government data, children eligible for free school meals have consistently been around twice as likely to be persistently absent compared to their wealthier peers. And it's not just in education, but across public services, there's strong evidence that children and families in poverty are less likely to be willing or able to access support and services, and less likely to feel a sense of belonging and trust. So what works to address this situation? I'm going to share a few key insights about what works to strengthen local and community support and tackle poverty stigma based on 2 key pieces of work. One is a rapid evidence review published today, which we conducted with Poverty Alliance and the Scottish Poverty Inequality Research Unit, and the other is an evidence review that colleagues conducted as part of a health determinants research collaboration embedded in Rhondda and Taff Council. So firstly, we need to remove stigma from access to support. It's one of the key places where it emerges. There are many service areas where means testing can create barriers to access and stigmatise those who do come forwards. One of the areas already mentioned today where the benefits of universal provision is clearest is in relation to free school meals. In a review of the impacts of universal free school meals that we delivered for the Welsh Government, we found that this approach results in higher take-up of this support amongst low-income children and offers multiple other benefits such as reduced stigma, improved learning environment, enhanced health and growth, improved classroom behaviour and reduced household food costs. Now, all primary school children in Wales can now access universal primary free school meals, thankfully, but at secondary school, eligibility is still means tested, not universal. And Child Poverty Action Group have estimated that around 25,000 secondary aged children in poverty miss out on a hot meal each day in Wales. Where universal provision is not possible or affordable, there is more we can do to remove barriers to access to practical and financial support for families through, for example, apply once, auto-enrolment and the removal of compliance demands. While there have been concerted efforts to boost social security take-up, around £2 billion is still being left unclaimed each year in Wales. One approach to overcome this is to allow apply once access to financial support. This is recognised in existing Welsh Government efforts to create a Welsh benefits system underpinned by the Wealth Benefits Charter, which, once phase 1 is complete, which should hopefully be soon, will provide apply once access to the council tax reduction scheme, free school meals and the school essentials grant. And as has been said already, work should continue to implement this and expand the Welsh benefit system as quickly as possible. There is also more that could be done in Wales to support auto-enrolment, whereby the onus is placed on service providers to remove the need for residents to complete an application form by, for example, water companies accessing existing household data to automatically register eligible residents on social tariffs. Another way in which we can strengthen local and community support for families in poverty is through co-location and ensuring a no wrong door approach. For example, in Scotland, welfare rights advisors have been embedded in 180 GP practices, which resulted in 16,000 people using the service, making financial gains of £23 million overall. And 89% of those people had not previously accessed welfare advice. And there's similar emerging evidence of the benefits of co-location related to family hubs, children's centres and school-based health services. Secondly, it's also necessary to ensure that public services are delivered in ways which promote dignity and respect, which will in turn help to make them more widely used. There is consistent evidence that cash transfers are associated with enhanced agency, autonomy and reduced stigma and, as is the case with the child payment in Scotland, reduced child poverty rates themselves. This allows households to decide how best to spend received cash to improve their own situation. It's also important to ensure welcoming and warm physical service environments for creating a positive experience. In contrast, as Karen mentioned, there's evidence that security-heavy layouts and surveillance in job centres, which frame clients as suspects, undermines trust and willingness to seek support. The manner and tone by which practitioners across public services deliver support is also key to ensuring a positive experience. There's evidence from across public services that public sector practitioners can, as with all of us, as with society writ large, carry unconscious biases towards children and families in poverty, and this can be unwittingly communicated through behaviour, language and decisions. There's evidence that poverty awareness training focused on non-judgmental practice can help, with studies showing that simulation role plays result in sustained improvements in attitudes and improved awareness, compassion and empathy. Thirdly, we also need to shift language, culture and systems more broadly. So leading poverty scholars, lived experience experts themselves and practice-based evidence suggests that involving lived experience experts in policy and service design, delivery and evaluation is a key way of working in coalition and avoiding othering. This is in line with the principle of nothing about us without us. Participation and co-production can help to reduce the gap between policy intentions, implementation and outcomes for those affected, for example, by surfacing needs, barriers and harms that can otherwise be missed. Involvement of lived experience experts is a central tenet of some of the key tried and tested models for strengthening local support and inclusion for families in poverty, including, for example, Children North East's poverty proofing programme, which has been successfully applied to a range of public services such as schools and maternity services, and also poverty truth commissions, which bring community and civic business commissioners together on an equal footing, build trust before problem solving and embed strength-based trauma-informed approaches. It's vitally important that we use and develop stigma-free, inclusive and non-judgmental language in developing public policy and public services intended to reduce or mitigate child poverty. The language of public policy and practice actively shapes people's experiences and mental health, as well as behaviour and willingness to take up support. So, for example, an experiment in the USA found that social housing tenants were 30% more likely to take up support if the offer was couched in language emphasising that it's not your fault. Politicians also have a role to play in using language which is compassionate and avoids perpetuating the myth which blames individuals and communities for being in poverty. And lastly, as shown by Joseph Rowntree Foundation framing research in the UK, the narratives we use also shape public support, or lack thereof, for poverty alleviation and the way that individuals and groups treat each other in communities. And I'll stop there. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Amanda. So we are into the kind of discussion and Q&A section of the webinar. So again, a nudge to add your questions to the Q&A. And if you've put them in the chat, please put them in the Q&A. But by way of kind of kicking off this this section of the webinar, I wanted to kind of encourage panelists to kind of reflect further on some of what they've talked about, to kind of reflect on the implications of the situation for an incoming government. So as we saw in Mike's presentation, and as those of you who've looked at other similar efforts to forecast, there's a kind of consistent message that comes through that the expectation at the moment is that living standards are unlikely to significantly improve over the next Senedd term. And yet, as Stefan touched on, an incoming government will have some very real constraints on what it can achieve. So the big decisions about tax and social security made by UK government will have a disproportionate effect. The food and energy prices that we all experience are largely driven by global markets, and public finances are not in good shape, meaning that there won't be scope to greatly increase spend. And yet, as we've been hearing, there's a lot that an incoming Welsh Government could do. So I wanted to start the conversation, as I said, by asking panelists to reflect further on some of the implications of this for an incoming government. Karen, I wondered if I could come to you first. I think listening to your contribution, one thing that struck me, which was echoed in some of what Amanda said, was the importance of working in a person-centered way. And I think from the work that I've seen and some of the work that WCPP has done, that what that implies is a much more kind of close working relationship with communities. So I'm interested in your reflections on that. I mean, obviously, your work with the Poverty Truth Commission in Swansea is is an example of that.
I mean, I just, it's kind of changing your perspective on kind of who are the experts in the room, I think. I come from a position of lived experience. So for me, it was a huge turning point when um, you could sit across from people who make big decisions about your life and actually feel for the first time that you've been heard or that your voice is
Mm,
being valued. I think when you're working through some of these systems, that quite often you don't feel like you have the ability to have a voice, or you don't have the ability, that your point of view is not valued. And so when we kind of prioritize that lived experience within systems design and delivery, it just has a big effect on you as a service user then, in terms of your confidence, your self-esteem, and kind of what you bring to that role. And I think we saw that throughout the community research that we were doing as well. People being listened to. I think it's something that we've really forgotten how to do.
mm,
And we've forgotten the importance of what that means and to have value in your voice. I've been an unpaid carer for many, many years, and when we live in a world that really values paid work, when your work isn't paid as a carer, that you don't feel that there's any value in that to society, and then that affects you personally. And I think, we can move forward in a better way together.
mm. Thank you. Thanks, Karen. I think the other thing that makes me think is that the kind of the importance of trying to join up around individuals. And I was struck from a number of contributions about the need to act on multiple fronts simultaneously. Um, Stefan, I wonder, you were talking about, an incoming government trying to set a strategy early on, and set that for the Senedd term. I suspect that one of the challenges will be around how do you join up around individuals while, setting a national strategy. You need these things to all be aligned and operating in concert, and that's a hugely challenging thing to try and pull off. So, at the risk of giving you a graveyard pass of a question, what's the answer to that?
I think so. I guess implicit what I was talking about is that I think given all the restrictions that you mentioned, is you need to think about where can your intervention, what's within your tools, have the biggest impact at scale, and you start there, and then you think about, okay, so who is missing out then? Because they don't quite fit neatly within the boxes of people who would benefit most from that. And what do we do to make sure that we kind of protect those people and that extra support there is people? I think that, given the limitations of the devolution model, I think that's how I would start with it. So, and that's why something like the childcare or the child payment are the things you come back to, because what is kind of within the gift of Welsh Government, child payment may be more arguable, but childcare certainly, it has got the ability to be doing more. It has got the powers to be doing more. And we know that it would make a difference to, kind of in terms of the things that it's got within its control that could be done reasonably swiftly. It's probably the biggest lever it's got to pull. So that's why it makes sense to start with that. And then you think, okay, what else is there? And then you make sure you've got those policies there that help you move in that general direction to protect those people who might not benefit from the main intervention. I think that would be where I would start personally. I think if I was starting out as the new Welsh Government.
Thank you. Amanda, I wonder if I come to you next, because I know that you focused your contributions around strengthening local and community inclusion and support, but I know you've also worked on that issue of childcare as well. I wondered if you wanted to kind of build off that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I completely echo what's already been argued that a child payment would, we know, make a huge difference if it is viable. But then obviously, as Stefan's just said, childcare is within the remit of the Welsh Government, and provision in Wales now is quite a lot less generous than it is in England. So those who are eligible for Flying Start are usually only getting sort of 2 to 3 hours a day, which, for any parent on the call who is trying to work, it's clearly 2 to 3 hours a day provision is not going to significantly remove barriers to work for those parents. So I think there's a lot of scope for expanding publicly funded and high quality childcare in Wales as a way to kind of reduce costs for families, encourage and enable parents to work, and to support child development. I know that kind of one of the justifications for keeping that provision to 2 to 3 hours a day is because there is evidence that young children kind of thrive best with that kind of bite-size, small kind of low number of hours. But then I think we also need to take into account the impact that growing up in a household in poverty has. So actually overall, I would argue for expanding those publicly funded hours for younger children.
Thanks, Amanda. Helen, turning to you next. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking, having kind of listened to all of the contributions, is I know, I mean, you mentioned advice services in your contribution, and I think I'm right in saying that Trussell's had kind of seen the value of kind of citing those kinds of services within food banks and the kind of the impact that that can have on people. I wondered if you wanted to reflect some more on that, or I mean, or feel free to pick up on any other of the strands of this conversation at this point.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. So we've had, over the last few years, we've been building up to the point that almost all of our food banks now are providing access to financial advice in the food bank, normally in partnership with local advice providers. And we have seen that for some people, it can be absolutely transformative, and particularly people who are struggling with debt, getting that resolved, and people who are struggling to get access to things like personal independence payments and disability benefits, which people on the call will know can be incredibly difficult. But once those come through, that can be the difference between somebody who is not eating properly, can't afford to run medical equipment, can't afford the bus fare when they finally get a hospital appointment, all of those things. And when you get your PIP sorted, it doesn't necessarily give you an amazing life, but for many people, it means they can afford the essentials and can participate more in their communities. But what we're seeing, I think, is two problems. One is that in many cases, advice services are on their knees. They've had massive funding cuts. There's demand going up. It's really hard to meet that. And that is a sustainability issue which we need to help the sector with. The other, though, is about access and how it's provided. So when we worked with the University of Bristol to evaluate the advice services that food banks were providing, and one of the big things they found was that for some people, trying to access advice services elsewhere hadn't really worked. Either because you were going to a local advice provider, you were standing in a queue for an hour, and then they ran out of slots. But also there is something about the trust that is developed when people are going to a food bank, and it's a relational place. You go in, you get a cup of tea, you have someone chatting to you, you build up a relationship. That kind of environment of trust and of care gives people the opportunity to then share really difficult financial issues, and to be able to see someone straight away who can help them with that expert advice. And it normally feels much less time pressured. So you're going to talk to, Dan, who's sitting in the corner, he'll take whatever time you need. So there is something about how you get those services into other community locations where people will feel able to go and where they will have that trusting relationship. On the other thing about what we should do, one thing I think we should be looking at, Welsh Government should look at, is making sure the money that is already in the system is working as hard as possible. So that's partly about removing barriers to access to support. It's also about making sure we are funding the right things, and cash first support, preventative services, that's where the funding should be going. And we should make sure we really maximise that at a local level, rather than funding sometimes a whole kind of lots of different things, all of which help someone in the moment, but they don't get at the drivers.
Thanks, Helen. And Mike, just to turn to you next, I mean, you talked about the work that you've done looking at progression, but I know at the Resolution Foundation, you've looked at kind of almost all of the issues you might be interested in. I know particularly around housing and economic inactivity. I wondered whether there are things you wanted to talk about there in relation to the work that you and colleagues have done.
Yeah, housing's not come up too many times today, but housing is incredibly important. The measure of poverty is income after housing costs. The big picture is that the private rented sector is becoming more and more important for families of lower incomes as home ownership becomes less and less affordable. So that is an issue which all governments should try and tackle. Uh, Suppose the two key, well, no, three key policies would be the number of houses that are being built in Wales, the level of local housing allowance, and perhaps the rights that renters get, which sort of affects their position to negotiate with landlords. Now, some of those, not, you know, some of those are definitely for the UK government. How many houses get built in the local area is obviously not very much for people in Wales. So I think, yeah, I just think we talk about housing and housing costs all the time, but I think we've got to remember it is also an important driver of child poverty. I mean, the biggest single ask we have is for the UK government to do something about local housing allowance so that it reflects the local level of rents. I mean, it's been since local housing allowance was set up in 2012, it's been sort of linked to earnings at about 3 years and not in the other 13, I think no, 12, if I maths correctly. But we really need a stable settlement where policymakers in the UK government realise that it has to be linked to rents, otherwise it's just otherwise it's unsustainable.
Thanks, Mike. Joe, I'm going to turn to you now. You've been tracking the questions in the Q&A, and you may well have questions of your own.
Yeah. Well, I think some of the questions you've already artfully peppered through to the panel, which is really useful. One of the questions that we've had is from Duncan Holtam, who says, to what extent are the policy actions needed to provide crisis support, tackle systemic poverty and deep systemic poverty different? And to tackle them, do they need different strategies and targets? Is an open question.
Thanks, Joe. And any of our panelists, I'm not going to throw it to anybody because it's a really interesting and also tricky question. Helen, you're bravely putting your hand up. Go for it.
So I think we need one strategy that brings it all together, because otherwise you will get the disconnect. But that strategy needs to explicitly focus on overall poverty and deep poverty, because you're right that there is a set of solutions that is needed for deep poverty, particularly where the kind of general solutions won't necessarily touch it. I think in terms of systemic and crisis, I think what I would say is they tend to operate in a cycle. So what you see is people who are stuck in often quite long-term systemic poverty, or in a very financially precarious situation. And then it doesn't take much. So one unexpected bill is enough to tip somebody into crisis. If there isn't good crisis support, they will then often end up in debt. That debt will hang around their neck as they try and recover. And so what we often see is something that could have been a short-term financial shock turns into long-term hardship because the crisis support wasn't there quickly enough and wasn't the right kind. So if you can get that crisis support working, you can prevent people going into that spiral and help people get back onto a stable footing. Then you need support which gets them from a kind of stable but bad situation up to a stable and better situation, and then to have enough resilience that another shock doesn't tip them back over the edge. So you need a strategy that does all of those things. And something like housing, as Mike said, that would figure in all of those. And in a sense, the same kind of things. We need social housing, we need LHA to be following rents, and we need private renting to be less insecure. That will help people at all stages in that poverty journey.
And I guess in that devolved sense as well, because those levers don't sit as neatly as they might do at a UK reserve level, means that strategy inherently has to be cross-government because it touches on all those different elements of public policy that you talk on. So quite a complex strategy, but one that inherently touches on all of those issues in one kind of cross-government document, I suppose. We've got another question here, which is from Anonymous. Child poverty rates differ greatly by region/local authority across Wales. What can local authorities do to help reduce child poverty in their areas? Because we've got a lot of people in the audience who are from local authorities across Wales as well.
Stefan.
So I think my sense of having worked with local authorities across Wales is everyone does something well and then doesn't do something else well. And I think there is something here about kind of making sure that all of that stuff is done across a piece. So the work we've touched on a fair bit today is around the Welsh Benefits Charter, kind of making it easier for people to have the kind of local authority administered support schemes like council tax, reduction scheme, free school meals, schools essential grant, get it all in one place. Now, the commitment to implementing the charter probably differs between authorities at the moment, I think it's fair to say. And you know that is an obvious example of where if we can get all local authorities operating at the highest possible level on that, that would make a meaningful difference to the lives of thousands of people across Wales. And I suspect you would see similar patterns in other policy areas across local authorities. I think it also links to what Helen was just talking about, actually, in terms of that link in between the crisis and the longer term strategic stuff, is to make sure that when they're taking their actions, are local authorities thinking about how does this fit into the strategic long term ambition, rather than we are responding to a particular crisis in a particular community at this very moment in time. And then the final thing, I guess, in terms of is a challenge for local government, is that I think there is sometimes a tendency to focus local authority support into communities that have very, very high levels of deprivation. But more often than not, more than half of children living in, the majority of children living in poverty in those given local authorities won't actually live in those areas that they're targeting or they're supporting. And that's not an argument against doing local area schemes. They have a role to play. But actually, if you prioritise your resources at 10% of the children, then what are you doing for the other 90% of the children that are living in poverty, but just happen to be living in poverty in slightly less deprived areas as a whole? So I think that's a challenge that there isn't an easy answer to, but I think kind of being conscious that if you just target your support in one place, you do need to be thinking about what you're going to be doing for the other children as well.
Go on, Amanda.
Add one thing to what you said, Stefan. We know from our work with some local authorities in Wales that some do have strategies to tackle poverty and child poverty and some don't. So it's, that's one of the reasons I would argue that there is this geographic variation. Obviously, there are lots of other reasons as well, such as geography and just the demography of different areas. So I think encouraging local governments in Wales to have a strategy where they articulate that child poverty is a problem and their kind of ambitions to reduce it within the kind of structure of the Welsh Government child poverty would be really, really helpful. And then lots of the things I spoke about in my kind of contribution, like local authorities have a huge role to play in shaping people's experiences of seeking and accessing support and the kind of psychological experience that results in. So that I would hope would be part of their strategies.
And I guess local government are the delivery agent of so much of what is Welsh Government policy, not only in this area, but across all different policy areas. And maybe there's that argument that we've kind of touched on a few times about having one strategy that is easily transferable onto government, local government, as the delivery agent of Welsh Government in so many different areas. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin in that. Okay, two interrelated questions. One from Philip Evans. How can we overcome barriers to coordinating support across communities, agencies, and the third sector? And another question about how can we collectively move further and faster to integrate preventative services like advice into crisis support services like the Discretionary Assistance Fund?
I can say a little bit about what we've learned from the work we've been doing recently to inform the trailblazer approaches to economic inactivity. So I think one of the things that research on economic inactivity has shown is the multiple barriers that people who are economically inactive face to accessing employment. So in Yorkshire, research showed that it was 6 barriers on average per each person. And so it does require a multidimensional and a multi-agency response. And so what the research we've done and from the Trailblazers has shown is, yes, you need multiple agencies, but you need actually one person responsible for coordinating that. So the role of kind of a holistic key worker who is the link point between an individual or a household or a family and those multiple agencies can be a really, really effective way of making all of that support joined up and person-centred and coherent.
Helen?
I was going to add, it's worth taking a look at the in Scotland, the Pathways to Advice and Cash Support project. So it's something that Scottish Government have helped to fund. Trussell's been involved. The Robertson Trust has funded the evaluation. And it's basically pilots in something like 8 areas, which has been all about trialing ways to join up the local ecosystems of support to ensure there's a cash first offer and to link that really closely to advice. And it has, I think, a lot of the things Amanda's talking about in terms of co-location, link workers, but there's some really good learning coming out of that, which we're drawing into various different bits of the UK. So it's worth Googling PACS, Pathways to Advice and Cash Support in Scotland, to have a look at that.
Well, thanks. And one final question, which is kind of underlying what a few of you have said is the solution, and that there's a lot of learning from Scotland to be done in this area, is from Liam Burke around the introduction of a Welsh child payment. And Stefan, you've spoken to this as being maybe what could be a keynote policy for a next Welsh government. What are the barriers to that being introduced, and what are the lessons from Scotland of delivering something that sits, moving money from one part of Welsh Government's budget to tackling something that is to some extent between devolved reserved powers, and what impact does that have functionally on a devolved government?
Yeah, so I'm aware that there are different views on this, and that my view might not be shared universally. However, what my view is that, okay, so it's clear the Welsh Government does not have the power to introduce new social security payments. However, I think it's done so on a number of occasions. So through COVID, most local authorities in Wales was providing £19.50 cash per week to all families, all children who were eligible for free school meals in lieu of those school meals. That's a child payment. We've seen with the care leaver pilot, where kind of care leavers are getting a weekly payment. Now, there's been differences with both of those in terms of DWP and UK government did not get involved at all in terms of the cash in lieu of free school meals. So that money was not included in universal credit calculations. There was no challenge about whether they had the power to do this, etc. Around the care leaver policy, however, the DWP have clawed that money back from people's payments. But the Welsh Government took the decision that even allowing for that, the extra cash for those people was still worthwhile. It was still making a positive difference to those people's lives. The child payment, I guess, would be a more headline-grabbing policy, so the risk of having intergovernmental battles probably is greater. But I think that's a political question, not a legal question, almost, in terms of that. And then there is the similar conversation about, do you think that offset that they decided to do with the care leavers policy would be worth doing with the child payments? The challenge would be the funding, because Scotland have been able to do it as part of a broader package of devolution. Therefore, there's kind of different powers come through the fiscal settlement, which has enabled them to have more money to do something like this. If you went down the route of saying, actually, you know what, this is technically already devolved, this isn't a new social security benefit, nothing to see here, DWP, then you have to do that from the money that you've already got within your budget. And obviously, that is a more significant cost, and maybe the solution is in the interim that you started off with a slightly tighter cohort of children, kind of maybe some of those children, maybe those children, younger children, for example, the group I said where there's a lot of gaps at the moment provision, that might be a more financially affordable way of doing it, whilst you could have geared up and tried to get clarity around the settlement and the other funding questions.
Thanks, Stefan. That's really interesting note to conclude on, and I'm afraid we do have to conclude now. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to our panelists, to our co-hosts at IWA, and to our audience as well. I found that a fascinating and stimulating discussion, and I hope you did too.